A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquat. Let me listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through some examples of or an example of women who had respect for men in the ancient times. And when you look at Babylon's culture promotes a certain sentiment, especially a very strong hatred, not just against men, but against the Israelite man also, right? And I kind of just want to go through and see in the lens and the perspective within our history, how were men actually viewed within the ancient times, when we were actually, settled in the land, when we had sovereignty, when we had peace amongst amongst our own people, we had our households, our substance, because a lot has happened and changed ever since then. And noticing that in these days and within Babylon, it has essentially, it promotes a very strong distaste for men through its different wines and different philosophies, right? This is why the scriptures describe the other nations are mad, because when the other nations, they come across here, they migrate here, their women are essentially poisoned, because they have an understanding of, now that they feel like they're essentially elevated above the man, and they get an understanding that they don't need a man, right? There is a certain type of mentality that a man is no longer needed, because essentially now that they're elevated and they have positions, they have so-called education, so there's a certain element of pride that's mixed into this culture. This is why the culture is so filthy, right? So and Esau has a huge hand in this. So let me get this first precept, before I actually start off the lesson here. And I sincerely pray. Actually, I'll get two precepts. This is Sirach chapter 10, verse 3. And it says, "An unwise king destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are in authority, the city shall be inhabited." So, Esau has essentially destroyed the minds of our women, through promoting that wine, those philosophies in regards to sexual liberation, in regards to feminism, because it has essentially uplifted them into thinking that they don't actually need a man. And importance, and when you go through our culture also, when you see that we had, and when we had our households intact, you see the importance of men actually passing on godly wisdom to their children, right? And a good example I normally like to reference is our forefather Tobit in the book of Tobit, when he was passing on that wisdom, when he got to a certain age, that he would become his own man, where you have his own substance and you have his own household, right? And you have his own wife, and you would cleave unto his own wife, right? And that that is essentially lost, because there is not a reverence for the man, and a reverence for the Israelite man, and the type of wisdom that he passes on, right? That is very much important, right? And you can use other examples too. David, when he was about to pass on to King Solomon, the information that he said to King Solomon to keep the charge and to keep the commandments, those things are not seen as important, right? To essentially because then you eventually, because you have children now that are essentially a duplicate copy of yourself, right? So, and let me just get this next precept before I ramble on too much. I'll get to the account. Let me go to What's it called? What's that? Second Ezra's. Um, okay, this is Second Ezra chapter 8, verse 50, and it says, "For many great miseries shall be done unto them that are in the latter time, shall dwell within in the world, because they have walked in great pride." And this kind of society that we live in regards to the pride, because now you have, because of that liberation, what you have now is a society where, there's no reverence for a man's presence within the household. There's no reverence, and because the man is merely seen as a meal ticket. It's essentially, he's just seen as, essentially a local ATM, right? There is no understanding as to why men are also, strongly important. Of course, that we have wicked men that are ruling, right? But it shows you there in this society there is no reverence for especially the Israelite man, within his household, right? So, and this stats will even show you, because children eventually become a lot more robust and more well-rounded when they have both of their parents, or even when they have when they come from a single father household, how important it is when their children come out, because the stats even show, in a secular sense, that the children become a lot more developed socially, academically, and they become a lot more independent when the father is actually active and around in their children's life, right, as opposed to the single mother households, right? So, I went off a little off topic there, but let me go to the account. I wanted to just read this account here in the book of Samuel in regards to what's it called? What's her name? Hold on. Abigail, right? Because we were speaking on some things in regards to women, and you do have good examples, and I just want to show an example of a woman that actually had a certain type of reverence for a man. It wasn't just a man that she was married to. Eventually she became married to him after the Lord took out her husband at the time. But I kind of just wanted to go through the sentiment of her having essentially that respect for a man and his presence, right? And this time, and even King David wasn't even king at this particular time, right? So I want to read down here. So this is 2 Samuel chapter 25, verse 18, and it says, "And then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, and 5 measures of parched corn, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. And she said unto her servants, Go on before me, behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal," right? So essentially, when you go back in the story, Nabal, there was an interaction between David and his men, and the men came in essentially in David's name, and essentially, Nabal had an opportunity to essentially, provide some substance, but he didn't take, because he had a lot of substance, but he didn't take any of his substance to actually be able to help out David and his men, right? So continuing on, it says in verse 20, and it says, "And it was so, and she rode on the asses, and when she came down by the covert on the hill, and behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. Now David had said, Surely in vain I have kept all that this fellow hath in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained unto him. and hath requited me evil for good. And the scriptures say, not to go too off topic, he that is evil in himself, who would he do good to, right? So, he had he had the David and his men, they did good to, essentially Nabal, and he repaid them back with evil, right? So, before, David got into that warlike spirit, Abigail essentially intervened, right? So this is what I'm reading here. This is verse 22, and it says, and so and more also that the Most High unto the enemies of David, if I leave all that pertain to him in the morning light, any that pisseth against the wall. And when Abigail saw David, and here's the really the key point here. It says, she hasted and lighted off her ass and fell before David on her face, and bowed herself to the ground, and fell at his feet, and said, Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be, and let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak to thine audience, and hear the words of thine handmaid. So this is the type of vibe that she gave off. Remember, this is this is their interaction, and David's not with this woman, right? She is essentially taking on that responsibility of the behavior of what her husband is doing, but she still is also showing a certain type level of reverence for David here. At this time, King David's not even king he's not even officially, become king at this time. I'll leave it like that, because King Saul was still in power. But the point really is, she expressed a certain sentiment of humility, right? And this is what's strongly lacking, within this society, because, humility is seen as something that is weak. It is seen as something that is, not as important, because the people here in this culture promotes pride, and, pride, when you go into the scriptures, scriptures talk about how pride is not, made for men, right? And pride is essentially when one departs from their maker, right? As a matter of fact, let me get that, and I'll come back to the account here. Where was I? I think that's Sirach 10. Okay, this is Sirach chapter 10 verse 12, and it says, and the beginning of pride is when one departeth from the Most High, and his heart is turned away from his maker, right? So this is the type of vibe, this is the kind of vibe that a lot of our women are in within this society. But this is also to show the complete contrast between the way our women are now versus presently, back in those times, right? So, and this is the way how the contrast really is where how Abigail, presented herself, right? She had on a certain level of humility. She had on, she was very graceful. She didn't, try and she didn't even try to combat. And that's another thing too. That's how we know as a nation we're so looked down upon, because the way how within our nation, a lot of our women even get into like physical fights with actual men, right? And that is so far out of order. That's how and then we become essentially as a laughing stock, right, in the eyes of the other nations, because look at the quality and the behavior and the conduct of the mannerisms of our women, right? So I'm going to go back here in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 25, and it says, and let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But thine handmaid saw not the young men of my Lord whom didst send. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing that the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, right? So she's still being respectful. She's still calling him Lord. They're not even together at this point, right? Eventually they do end up together, but the point really is she had a certain level of respect for the man and his presence, right? Let me get that word Lord in the etymology. Let me see what that word, it gets tossed around a lot. Let me just see if I can get it. So a lord is someone, okay. It says master of a household, ruler, superior, husband. It says Greek kryos. It says one who guards the loaves. It says a keeper, a guardian, right? It says a household servant. So somebody watching over a household. That's why you get the word landlord from, right? And if brothers ever seen that show called Game of Thrones, you know, there is that was a very common term that's used for the men in whether they like men in general, I should say, right? Especially men that held, you know, particular titles, you know, like in this one character I'm thinking of in the show, within a certain family, you know, the women always called, you know, my lord, my lord, you know, they always had a certain type of reverence for the man and his intellect, his presence, you know, his wisdom, you know, because there was a certain level of a reverence that women had for the men, because they understood, even back then within the Middle Ages, they understood that the man actually carries the seed. He actually he's able to extend his genetics to continue on the family line, right? That's very, very important, and you see that within the show, right? You know, that's why, you know, when, you know, they had certain families and they come together, you know, they wanted their sons to marry, you know, certain daughters, right? So they can continue on the family name, right? They wouldn't just want their daughters to marry anybody, right? Let me go back here. It says here, verse 26, now therefore, as the Lord Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from the coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself, and thy own handmaid, now let thy enemies, and all that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. And now this blessing which thine handmaid hath brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. I pray thee, forgive thy trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord, right? So she understood that, you know, David essentially had a strong responsibility and had a strong mantle, you know, in making sure, you know, because he was a very profitable young man, you know, within the army. You know, he was a warrior too, right? He was a musician. He was, you know, he served, you know, as a essentially as a representative, to be able to to keep the enemies off, right? You know, primarily, you know, these different Philistines, right? So David was essentially very profitable to the nation at this time, and he wasn't even king yet. But it just shows also that, you know, the men had they had a certain level of reverence for the man, right? Especially a man of war, right? And that's another thing also within this society. They don't even care about the men of war, the veterans within America, they get tossed, they when they come back from battle, they or from their different tours, they get tossed to the side. A lot of them are homeless, right? As a matter of fact, let me get a precept on that, and I'll close. That shows you that more and more the society doesn't have that reverence for men at all. I believe that's Sirach 26. This is Sirach chapter 26, verse 28, and it says, "And there be two things that grieve my heart, and the third maketh me angry, a man of war that suffereth poverty, men of understanding that are not set by, and one that returneth from righteousness to sin. The Lord prepareth such and one for the sword," right? So this is, that's why America has a lot of judgment, awaiting it, because they don't show a certain level of reverence for the ways of the Lord, right? They show, and they proud, they live deliciously, and this is how you treat your own citizens, right? This is why there's so much decay going on within your nation, right? So I guess I'll just leave it there. Actually, I'll read verse 28 again, and it says, "I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord," right? So it's like going back to the point about David, he was fighting the battles, and essentially he was a very profitable vessel and the upcoming king of Israel, right? And it says, "And evil hath not been found in thee all thy days," right? So essentially wishing him, good success, right? And the scriptures talk about how essentially the prayers of the humble pierceth the clouds. Look at the way she conducted herself. She wished him well, David and his men, and she even gave him some substance, right? She was doing essentially good to the godly man, right? This is very pleasing, right? But you don't see a lot of our women, doing these things and seeing that they don't have that reverence or that care for, whether it's their own men or even their own fathers, so to speak. And it says, I'll just end off with this precept here. This is Sirach chapter 12, verse 2, and it says, "And do good to the godly man, and thou shalt find a recompense, if not from him, yet from the Most High," right? So it shows you, she was doing good to godly men, right? Because David was a man after the Lord's heart, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but I just, I really hope and sincerely, hope that this lesson, is truly edifying. I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.